Margie Warrell, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
It is great to be with you, David.
Well, I'm so happy to have you here. We're going to be discussing your book that you've written a number of books about courage and bravery and so on. The latest one is How to Be Braver. Is this right? Yeah, How to Be Braver. And where's the title here? Stop Playing Safe. That's what. Stop Playing Safe, How to Be Braver in your work, leadership, and life. And I have to say that your book is wonderfully inspiring, and it's no wonder that you've had such a remarkable career. And were you courageous as a child? Is that something you were born with, or, how did it come about?
I believe all of us have the capacity to be brave. And as a kid, I would have struggled as much with fear and doubt as probably most. But I think I learned to be brave as a child. And I needed to just kind of define it. To me, being brave is not the absence of misgivings and doubts and fears. It is choosing to act in their presence. And I grew up on a dairy farm in rural Victoria, Australia, about 4 hours from Melbourne. And, we were 7 kids. My dad milked cows for 50 years. It was wasn't a lot of money. We just sort of entertained ourselves a lot. And one thing that I think I learned that sort of helped to bolster my courage was I was leading up to my 10th birthday. I remember kind of pleading, could I get a horse? And there was very little money. My dad had to sell all these cows because of a prolonged drought. And he sold 2 pigs to purchase my horse, Robbie. And I wanted a pony. And I remember looking up and Robbie was like, whoa, he's like, logic to buying horses as they had to shoes and clothes for us kids get it 2 sizes too big. So I had to sort of summons my courage and get out there and learn to ride him. And then a couple of years later, we won another horse in a raffle who was a crazy wild horse. And I had to kind of dial up my courage again and often fell off. But I think those experiences kind of growing up where there was a lot of falling off horses, I think you become a little bit more resilient, and that does embolden you a little bit to be brave. Yeah.
I think I've got sort of an image of the Australian personality, if there is such a thing, as being pretty out there and pretty brave and speaking your mind and so on. Does that ring true at all?
No.
Okay. Tell me why not.
I don't know. I actually think many people in Australia struggle with being bold and brave. And I wouldn't say, I'm not saying that there's not lots of brave people in Australia. I'm just rather, there's this cultural phenomena in Australia known as tall poppy syndrome. And I think it comes from our convict heritage, where anyone who aspires to rise too high runs the risk of being cut down like a tall poppy flower. And I think that there can be a real reticence for taking risks in the Australian culture. And Australians are known for being larrikins and being down to earth. So Australians are absolutely very self-deprecating and humble and friendly. So absolutely, I would say that is true. But I wouldn't say that the Australian culture nurtures courage and boldness. In fact, I think that the American culture is far more facilitates risk-taking and entrepreneurialism and self-belief, probably more so than the Australian culture.
Now, you've traveled all over the world, and I assume you've spent time in America as well?
Yeah, I lived here for 11 years. Until 2012, and then I just returned to live here 6 months ago. So
where are you living?
I am just outside Washington D.C. in Northern Virginia.
Okay, very nice area. And so I'm interested in more about your life, and maybe as you think about the development of your courage and so on, if there are stepping stones that you can identify let's say, going all the way up to college or through college? What are the major stepping stones?
I think number one is embracing life as the adventure that it is. I think we often treat life, we try and have it in tidy little neat boxes. And I mean, we're wired for certainty, we're wired for security and safety and predictability. But I think for me, even leaving home and going to university, I was the first person in my family extended to go to college. And it was scary. But I was curious. I wanted to experience more of the world than the small rural community where I grew up. And that time at university only whet my appetite to explore more of the world. So I think I've always kind of had a sense of adventure. Like, I want to live life. I don't know if it was Thoreau who said, suck the marrow from the bones of life, but, to really experience life in all its fullness. I think, so often we can just live a very comfortable, neat, tidy life and we miss out on experiencing it. So I think that sense of adventure was definitely like, kind of, what have you got to lose? I think often we sort of focus more on what we have to lose than what we have to gain. But secondly, a willingness to make peace with discomfort.
Yeah.
Break ranks with our comfort zone and make peace with discomfort, I think, is really crucial. And let's face it, we're not wired for that. And I've spent a lot of my life outside my comfort zone. And continually, it's not that I haven't got lots of self-doubts. I've had lots of fears. I think I've had many of them. My own upbringing, I think, left me with a loud voice in my head saying, who do you think you are to do anything, to write a book, to travel the world? And I had a very, very humble education. In my elementary years at a tiny school with like 13 kids in the school and in a rural high school. And
yeah.
I think I've got really good at, I've developed some level of mastery at not letting my fear hold the reins.
Yeah, I would say so. As I read your bio and so on, you've been all over the place. Where did you go to college? Was that there in Australia?
Yeah, I went to a university that doesn't even exist anymore to do my undergrad as an 18-year-old. And it got eaten up by a bigger university, which is now Monash University, which is really big, but the one I went to didn't exist. I don't think it is now. It's kind of small. But then when I was in my late 20s, I went back to university distance and I was living in Papua New Guinea, actually, and did psychology degree, and then moved from Papua New Guinea back to Australia, and then ended up living in the United States, moved here just after 9/11. In fact, 20 years ago, on the 7th of October, I moved here to the US. And when I was here, I decided to use the psychology and actually become a coach and start my own coaching practice while I was living in Dallas, Texas at the time. But I didn't know anyone in America. I had 3 tiny children. Then I had a 4th child here. And I didn't know anyone. I was very much the stay-at-home mum with 4 kids with zero network outside of a few other mums in my neighbourhood. And so I would go out and give free talks to any group that would have me to try and get coaching clients, which for me was an act of courage, because there was a voice in my head going, who do I think I am to even have a business?
Yeah.
But I was very passionate, and I still am extremely passionate about helping people live the biggest life they're capable of living.
Yeah, that just runs throughout your book. How did you get to Papua New Guinea?
Yeah, so some people don't even know where Papua New Guinea is. So early on, I finished university. I went traveling around the world for a year, got a round the world ticket.
Wow.
Few travelers checks. I earned money pouring beers and sorting corn in a frozen food factory. Got a round the world ticket, spent a year around the world. And when I got back to Australia after a year, 22 years of age, I met my husband, still my husband. In fact, we're married 28 years this Saturday.
Congratulations. Yeah.
And we were like, well, let's go and let's see who can get the first job overseas. I'd traveled around on a shoestring budget and we had a competition, and we were thinking London, New York, Paris, maybe Shanghai, Bangkok, Hong Kong. And he came home one day and said, I think I can get us an overseas assignment with my company. And I was like, okay. And he said, yeah, not quite what you were thinking. I'm like, okay. And he said, Papua New Guinea. I was like, wasn't in my top 500 list. But
hardly.
We just decided, what the heck. And at the time, it was one of the most dangerous countries in the world outside a war zone. But we just decided, let's do it. We were young, we were married a year or so. And so we just did it for the adventure. And while our time there was eventful, and it wasn't all smooth sailing, it was incredibly formative and broadening, expanding. And I look back on the 3 years that we had there, a few with some difficult moments in the midst of them, which I've written about in Stop Playing Safe, and actually also in my book, You've Got This. And I look back on it and realize it only kind of built my courage muscles for life even more, even though it wasn't all easy.
Yeah, well, share with us those difficult moments, if you will, even if they're in the book, if you don't mind. Because some of them
are in the book, different ones are in different ones of my book. But so probably the most significant was I really went on a big journey of inner self-discovery while there. I mean, I really got into personal development. I discovered self-help books. Wayne Dyer was instrumental in my own journey. Scott Peck, The Road Less Traveled. And but I was actually 19 weeks pregnant with our first baby. We were about 2 years in. And I was working in a company, and 3 men stormed in, and they came into my office, assumed that I knew where the cash was on premises for the staff, the local staff who were paid in cash, and I didn't. And they had guns, and one of them put their sawn-off shotgun up against my forehead and said, "Oh my God, open the safe." And I was like, I don't know how. And it was the truth. I didn't know how to open the safe. I had no idea where the cash was. It was just outside my role. And they just kept thrusting the gun, open the safe, open the safe. It probably was a minute. It felt like hours. And then said, okay, get down on the ground. And I went down and laid on the ground. And I remember they left one standing over me, and he put his hand up between my thighs. I had a skirt on, and he put his hand up between my thighs. And I remember in that moment being far more terrified of being taken back to their village and gang raped, which was an all too common occurrence, than I was of being killed. And after a few minutes, they clearly found the cash somewhere else on the premises. And I was working for a fairly small company, and they left. And I honestly had thought that would just never happen to me. I knew PNG wasn't it was a fairly lawless country, but I just never thought it would happen to me. And then 10 days later, just 10 days later, I was getting 19 weeks sonogram scan. And again, never thought it would happen to me. And the technician, I should have seen it from their eyes, but they said, how many weeks did you say you were? I'm like, 19. And I was told that my baby had died. And I was told it was pure coincidence that those 2 events would happen in such close succession. I hadn't been physically hurt in the armed robbery, but 2 such pretty life earth-shattering events, earth-shattering to my assumptive world anyway, really knocked me in terms of how the world works. And but they are ultimately a catalyst for my own, what we call post-traumatic growth. And I did a lot of soul searching, and I wrote in a journal, and I have a pretty strong faith, and I lent on it heavily. And I remember very clearly coming out of that, I received a lot of sympathy from people, a lot of empathy, and just being very clear, I do not want to be defined as a victim. And I do not want to be a victim to the fear that those events had created either. And just, yes, stuff had happened outside my control. I was a victim in one aspect, and certainly in one perspective, I was a victim to a violent robbery, and I lost a baby, as many, many, many other women have before me and have since and can have again. But I just didn't want to operate from a victim mindset. And I wanted to make sure I used that experience in a way that was positive, that ultimately would have me living a more rewarding life, a more fulfilling life. And in the aftermath of that, in that year that I was due to have my first baby, I went back and started studying psychology, and I'd already had a burgeoning interest in it. And, that journey, I'm still on that change of path today. I didn't know where that was going. I thought maybe I'd become a psychologist. I had never heard of coaching at that point. I certainly never, in my wildest imagination, would have told you I'd end up writing books and speaking on stages and doing media and all the stuff that I've done since. But while I was also in Papua New Guinea, I found myself the confidant of a lot of people who were struggling. It was an intense place to live. And it was the seeds of realizing I had a gift at helping people to get present to their lives. And I knew I needed a toolkit to help people, because I had a big heart. I had a heart for people, and I had a natural, I think, gift at helping people reframe their situations, but I didn't have any skill in that domain. I wasn't trained in anything to do with psychology, coaching, counseling. And so, but it definitely started that journey that, I'm still on today, and one of, inner discovery, and where do we as human beings sabotage our own happiness and create our own suffering because of the beliefs that we tell ourselves that are true, which are not true, because of the stories that we spin, because of the fears that we have of our own lack of worthiness, and where we hold ourselves back from taking the very actions that would allow us to connect to our own innate worthiness and to open doors of opportunity and to forge deeper, more meaningful relationships. And so, I've very much been on a journey that's continuing to unfold ever since then, of helping people to really live the highest vision for their lives, and to know their own potential, and to really ultimately honor their own gifts and live their own purpose. And I'm still figuring it all out. I'm still learning, I'm still growing, and hopefully still helping other people on their own journey. I think we're all on our own hero's journey in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah, you write about post-traumatic growth in your book, and there is a section where you talk about 3 tips for post-traumatic growth. They were probably somewhere in the story that you just told us, but what would you say are the 3 tips?
Yeah, well, I think being really clear about looking for ways you can take your pain and your hardship and heartache and apply it in meaningful ways, to me, is at the heart of it. Post-traumatic growth is not can still exist in and simultaneously with post-traumatic stress. We know post-traumatic stress is, we hear about a lot, PTSD.
Yeah.
But you can still experience PTSD, which I had some PTSD after that robbery. I was fragile. I was overly reactive to certain things for quite a long period of time. But I was also on this journey to use that experience in a way that would be positive, not just for myself, but for others. Connection with other people, being connected, having support and community really facilitates that growth. And thirdly, having a belief system that we're connected to something greater than ourselves. and that no experience that we ever have, there is nothing, that life is ultimately happening for us, not to us. And I think when you're really looking for ways to facilitate all of those aspects, you know, the spiritual growth, the connection with others, the purpose and meaning, that really helps to facilitate that experience of growth. That doesn't mean it's not hard and crappy and that we would wish it on our worst enemy, those experiences, but adversity has a way of introducing us to aspects of our own humanity that we would never sometimes experience otherwise. And I actually think the COVID pandemic, the last 18, 20 months or so, as difficult as it's been, and it's been difficult, and many people have been very challenged. I was extremely challenged in March 2020 when my husband got COVID and went in to get a test and didn't come out of hospital, was admitted to the hospital, and I didn't see him for 30 days.
Oh,
and I had
goodness.
three children on the other side of the world, two of whom found themselves homeless when their universities here in the United States closed. I was living in Singapore, international borders closed. And, you know, and here I was with this family splintered across the world, husband in hospital. I was put into a quarantine. Ironically, I was due to start a book tour for my book, You've Got This. And I had to keep looking at the title going, I've got this, I've got this, I've got this. But I think when there is so much around us that is so uncertain, we have to look within ourselves for the certainty that we seek. And I really believe that in every struggle and those times that test us the most have the greatest lessons to teach us. And whoever's doing it tough right now that might be listening to this, you mightn't enjoy it, you mightn't like it, you might be wishing all your problem away. But to zoom up, kind of press Google Earth and look at it through the larger scheme of life and ask yourself, you know, if this journey of life is just it's a wild, wondrous, albeit messy, sometimes crazy adventure that none of us get out of alive.
Right.
You don't always choose the hand you're given. You do not choose the hand you're given, but you do always get to choose how you play it. And likewise, we don't always choose our experiences in life, but we sure as heck have the opportunity to choose our experience of life. How do I want to process it? And I think, you know, how do we choose to look at it? What's the language we choose to use? How do you want to describe it? As a total disaster, as a nightmare, or as an opportunity for you to show up in the world with more courage, with more authenticity, with more humility, with more grace, and decide who you want to be in the midst of those times when you mightn't have a choice about your actual outer circumstances, and to go, yeah, but, you know, my dad used to take me fishing as a kid in our old rusty tin boat, and he would just say, sometimes it would spring a leak, and he'd say, you know, Margaret Mary, boats don't sink because of the water around them. They sink because of the water that gets in them. And I think we have to continually look within ourselves and go, how do I not let the negativity in, not let the fear-mongering in, not let the fear-mongerers and the cynics and the naysayers and the doomsdayers and the negative people around me get into me? And how do I choose to show up in the world so that one day when I'm at the end of it, because we're all going to get to the end of it, that's a given, that I can look back and go, I feel good about how I showed up in life, particularly in the stormy times.
Yeah. One of the things I loved about your book was that you talk about the pandemic, I think, in the foreword, and I think that's so important to acknowledge, hey, this is what's going on, you know, and I pick up a self-help book and expect a lot of platitudes and cheerleading and so on. So for me as a reader, it really helped to balance it, that you acknowledge, okay, this is the situation we're in right now. It's a worldwide crisis. There's climate change, there's a pandemic, and But then you kind of go beyond that and you say, well, you can either get totally sucked into that, or you can rise to the challenge. And your book is full of wonderful aphorisms. You've got lots, I don't know if aphorism is the right word, but little short, punchy sentences. And many are contained in the kinds of things that you've been talking about right now. I made note of a few of them. Let's see. Your brain is hardwired to keep you safe, not make you happy. And we've been hearing a lot about how our brain is hardwired to respond to fear, that fear is there to keep us alive. You say, learn to manage your fear or your fear will manage you. And rename risk, turn fear into an ally.
Yeah.
So just lots of great
and
one-liners like that.
I want to just add to that and say that, I mean, until very recently over the course of human history, our brains have evolved, obviously, to keep us safe and to be on alert for potential threats to our well-being. And for much of human history, those threats were predators. And yet now we're living in a time where we're pummeled 24/7 with news cycles laden with fear-mongering headlines. And I don't think our brains have yet adapted, because of course it takes a long time for our brains to adapt to the world that we're in today, this digitally overwired world in which we're pummeled with reasons to hunker and reasons to feel afraid. And I believe that many people struggle to discern between legitimate risks and threats and those that actually they need to take. People are too afraid to go out and live their lives because they're afraid. So many people live under this cloud of fear. And yet it's like people are more afraid of flying planes than they are getting in a car, when actually driving in a car is more dangerous. People say to me, I'm scared to go to Australia. You have so many venomous, poisonous creatures. It's true. But actually no one's died of a spider bite since the 70s. And yes, 2 people may die of snake bite a year in Australia, but you're 3,000 times more likely to die of a gunshot in the United States. So we just often aren't very good at assessing risk. And it's called Stop Playing Safe because too many of us live too safely. We're afraid of, the shadows in the dark. And I think that we have to be willing to embrace life's inherent uncertainty and to take risks, to live a little bit more boldly. And that's not about being reckless. It's not about denying our vulnerability. It's not about throwing caution to the wind and being stupid. We need fear. Fear would have stopped us doing stupid things. I would have done more dumb things in my teenage years had I not had fear. But be careful not to let fear hold the reins of our lives. And I meet so many people who live their lives inside their comfort zone, afraid of everything is too scary. There's risk. Oh, don't do that. Oh, it's risky. That's risky. Yeah, it is risky. But what are you putting at risk? If you sit at home, or if you don't put your hand up, speak up, venture out onto that limb, ask them out on a date, leave that job that you're miserable in, leave that relationship that makes you lonely, say yes, say no, say enough, whatever it is. And I truly believe that in the long arc of life, we fail so much more from timidity than we ever do from overdaring. And that courage, to quote Amelia Earhart, is the price that life asks of us for really having fulfillment. We have to take risks. We have to get uncomfortable. And honestly, the longer you spend in your comfort zone, the smaller it gets and the more things that scare you. So there's a real price we pay. There's a hidden tax on not doing the very things that sometimes scare us, on playing it too safe and not, sometimes just saying, what the hell, I'm going to just feel my fear, breathe in faith, breathe out fear, and do it anyway.
Yeah. What are your thoughts about people who have children and grandchildren and so on in this environment that you refer to, where there's constant bombardment of fear-mongering kinds of messages? And so we've got that combined with the social isolation, which I'm not so sure is going to go away anytime soon. You must have some thoughts about how people can cope with that.
Well, one, I think courage is a skill. It's not a personality trait. It's not like, oh, yes, I was born courageous and I'm sorry, you'll just never be correct. That's not true. Courage is a skill, and like all skills can be learned. And while some people may naturally be more comfortable with risk-taking, I interviewed Richard Branson a few years ago, and he said how he was like, took the third mortgage out on his home when he was 27 or whatever. And I was like, man, I wouldn't be comfortable. I don't have that tolerance for risk-taking, right? But it's a skill, and all of us can build it. And I wrote another book called Brave. It's okay. So come out by the title, Train the Brave. We can train the brave within us. And we train the brave within us every time we act on our answer to this question. What would I do if I was being brave? Sometimes that's confide a secret. Sometimes that's extend an invitation or make an ask, risk rejection. Sometimes that's going after something we really want. Sometimes it's leaving a situation that we don't like and just inviting a whole world of uncertainty in. And so to anyone who's struggling, and we know a lot of people right now are struggling with anxiety, the more you focus on what scares you, the more scared you will become. And so if you are feeling anxious and afraid, I invite you, instead of thinking about all the things you don't want, because that's where our brains go, right? We have that loss aversion bias, that negativity bias. Focus, what is it you do want? And what's one thing you can do today that will move you toward it? And even if that's uncomfortable, do it. Pick up the phone, send the email, connect with someone, whatever that is. And tomorrow, what's another thing you can do? And every day, train that courage muscle, train the brave. And 10 days from now, you're going to be a bit braver. And 6 months from now, you're going to be way braver. And a year from now, you mightn't even recognize the person that you were.
You know what? That might be a great message for us to wrap up on, because I know that you've got a keynote presentation to give right after this, and so I want to give you a little bit of breathing space to do that. But you've really managed to, just in your speaking to us here, to cover so much of what's in the heart of this wonderful book and other books that you've written. And so I want to thank you for being my very inspiring guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Well, thank you, David. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and to share this message with your audience. And I just have to have faith that those who are listening, that something will have just spoken to that deep truth within them. And if something resonated, I can only encourage you. Don't ignore it. And if you've got this like, oh, I need to do that, do it. Even if your knees are shaking, I promise you, you will be so glad you did.
Wonderful.